several years now. What was the year that we opened in 2008, when we opened the Center for Research in Chinese Language and Literacy Education here at UBC. She is a specialist, a widely published and widely sought after speaker on topics in applied linguistics, second language teaching and learning, and an area I think of particular interest to us, especially those of us who are maybe teaching people who see, students who see Chinese language as a heritage language, but they live in Canada, okay, which raises some really interesting questions about identity, individual identity, about social identity. Am I primarily a Chinese person who happens to be in Canada, or am I a Canadian who happens to be of Chinese heritage? All of these are really important issues in the development of one's self-concept. And Patricia, Professor Duff, is an expert in this field. And she's, as I said, she's been she's widely published through her research project in the Center for Research in Chinese Language and Literacy Education. They've published a book entitled Learning Chinese, Linguistic, Sociocultural, and Narrative Perspectives. She's going to talk to us, she's going to address us today on a specific area of her expertise. Today, her talk is entitled Learning Chinese, Negotiating Identities, Communities, and Trajectories. Heritage language learning, I think, is not just looking back to preserve something which is precious and worth preserving. You might have difficulty in persuading a young person to believe that that is really, really important, that is as important as preparing for my future, especially my future here. But it's looking forward to playing a meaningful role in a globalizing world in which Chinese language and culture will be at least as important and perhaps even more important than European languages. So what are the implications of multiple languages and cultures for young Canadians of Chinese ancestry or of European ancestry, either one? What are the implications for young Canadians' individual and social identities? Well, I hope after this morning's presentation we will understand a lot more about that. So it's my pleasure to introduce and please give a warm welcome to Professor Patricia.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome, and it's my pleasure to be here and an honor to be asked to speak at your conference, the Canadian National Conference on Chinese Education, sponsored by the Canadian Association of Chinese Language Schools. 大家好. I would just like to say what a wonderful event it is that so many of you participate in and have been participating in, apparently, for many years with your sponsors from TICO and the commercial world and people from the schools, the community schools, and so on. I see friends here. I see former graduate students, current graduate students, colleagues from the schools. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome you here to my university, UBC, even though this is not on our territory, which is over across campus. Buchanan is in the Faculty of Arts, and I'm in the Faculty of Education. So I'll just tell you about the outline of today's presentation, and then I will proceed. So I'll first give you a bit of an overview of what is going on in Chinese language education here locally, and not only at present, but a slight historical contextualization. And then I'll talk about trends in doing research on Chinese language learning as well as in Chinese language education. Then I will present some case studies. Actually, I'll just turn this front light down. I'll talk about case studies of Chinese language learning. That's one of my areas of specialty, looking at individual language learners and trying to understand the issues, the experiences, the joys, the frustrations, and so on, and what we can learn from those. So I'm going to give you 2 heritage language learner profiles and 2 non-heritage language learners. Then I would like to discuss some of the issues that come up across the cases, and in terms of my title, theme, which is Identities, Communities, and Trajectories, and I will conclude with some implications for language educators. Jan kindly introduced me and mentioned the center that I'm a part of, which he was generous enough to come to help us inaugurate 5 years ago. And some of you have attended our events, but we have a website, and occasionally we have public events for Chinese teachers, and these are open to the public. My own specialty is not really Chinese language education, but it's primarily English language education, but increasingly I've moved into Chinese because it's such a wonderful area for educational opportunities and research, especially here in Vancouver, and it had been rather neglected. So I'm very happy to join my colleague Dr. Duan Li in Asian Studies and others on campus to spearhead different activities. So that's what Jan looked like 5 years ago, and that's what I looked like 5 years ago. I think someone earlier said some of us get slimmer and some of us get, well, anyway, I'm in the latter category. We have, in some summers, we've had non-credit certificate institutes for Chinese language educators, and that's an image of some, and I believe some are in this room. We have invited specialists in things like bilingual education, language immersion, come and take part in symposia, experts in non-European orthography and literacy. This was Keiko Koda last year, and other kinds of research activities. So I'm a learner in this, and trying to lead from behind in a way, but very happy to do so. So let me just say a few words about the local and global contexts for Chinese language education. First, how many of you are not from British Columbia? You're from somewhere else. Oh, welcome, great. About maybe half are from outside. And I hope you enjoy being on the campus and in the Lower Mainland these days. But as many of you who are from here know, Chinese language education has actually had a long history in BC. It didn't start with the gold rush or the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway, but soon after Chinese laborers and workers and merchants settled in BC, they wanted to bring Chinese tutors over for their children, especially the wealthy merchants who could afford to do that. And they set up private schools and tutors for their children. In Victoria, in particular, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, eventually a Chinese public school was established. Oops, this is going on ahead of me. And you see, and part of it was to teach the children Chinese. Part of it was because the children had difficulty being integrated within the English schools. In Vancouver, Chinese schools were established soon afterwards, And over the 20th century, many kinds of curriculum came, textbooks and so on, from mainland China, from other areas. And one of the very important aspects was learning to write letters back to China for people. So, and it was in Baihua, so in a vernacular written form, learning to write letters, and as well as other things, morality tales and culture. So this is one of the early sets of textbooks with the mailman coming to deliver a letter and one of the texts. Well, let's fast forward to the present. We know that Canada is an officially bilingual country with English and French, but it's no surprise to you here that Chinese is also a language of increasing importance given our position on the Asia-Pacific, the gateway here. And Chinese, as you know, is spoken in more and more homes and communities. And that has led to a number of very exciting new developments with respect to Chinese education. I'll come to those in a minute. So this is from 2012, the latest census, and this was published by the CBC, showing the local immigrant languages spoken, 16% Cantonese, 12% Mandarin, and Chinese non-specified dialects, 12%. And the census data said the combined number of people who spoke either Cantonese, Mandarin, or an unspecified Chinese language accounted for 40% of the population who spoke an immigrant language as their main language at home. So this is showing the changing trends. But what about Chinese education in British Columbia currently? As some of you know, we have now 2 schools that have early Mandarin English bilingual programs. On the top right, the instructor's actually here today. Katie Sun, this is from the school in Coquitlam, Walton Elementary. This is Jameson, which had a longer established program from grade 4. This picture in the middle is from Norquay Elementary, and they have a team of teachers here today as well. And they started their Mandarin English early bilingual program a year after Coquitlam did. And in addition to that, since 1998, we've had an official curriculum in BC, Mandarin Chinese grades 5 to 12, which, by the way, is available on the web under BC Ministry of Education, Integrated Resource Package. And besides that, we have thousands of students studying Mandarin at this university and, of course, at other post-secondary institutions. One thing I'm very happy about is that an increasing number of those students are not from Chinese heritage backgrounds, because in the past it was almost 100% Chinese heritage students in the program here at UBC, and now there's there's more space for non-heritage learners too. And I think that's very healthy for the programs and for our Anglo-Canadians. And there's an image down at the bottom of some of the presenters at one of the recent Chinese New Year celebrations. And then this book on the bottom right is an image of a book Duan Duan Li, my colleague, did, Reading into a New China for advanced Chinese, especially advanced heritage learners. So many things are going on. And then when I look around here, all of those heritage language Saturday programs, Sunday programs that many of you have been laboring in, a labor of love for many years. In fact, I see the people wearing uniforms, that you have the teachers and staff uniforms to instill the pride and the professionalism, and it's wonderful. And congratulations for your long-standing efforts. We know, though, that people from Montreal and Toronto and Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, different parts, we know that Mandarin teaching and learning is taking place across a much wider range of contexts now within Canada and well beyond. And then the populations and contexts are changing. So we have people learning on the top right by online or virtual means. This is from our Chinese New Year party here this year in the middle. And people learning even by Second Life. This is called Chinese Island. And some programs now are having students take part in an immersive simulated worlds where they use Chinese, and so on and so forth. This is the Taiwan National Normal University program recently, the people participating in that. And then there's this lady down at the bottom, and you think, what's she doing there? Well, more and more people are lifelong learners, and they realize that to keep their minds active, to keep engaged in the world and excited by new knowledge, older people are starting to learn, older non-Chinese people are starting to learn Chinese too. And I'll give you her case later. So in short, we see Chinese heritage learners in many different contexts, not just Canada, US, UK, Australia, where the most research has taken place, but also in places like Peru, or Jamaica, or Madagascar, or Mauritania, these different places. And foreign language learners, people who are learning in their home countries, whether Australia or Zambia, and then some of them who go and study abroad, go to China, go to Taiwan, Singapore, wherever, and some of them stay abroad. Some are sojourners, migrants, they're experts who are learning Chinese to be able to do other things, and Chinese is not just the only goal. And there are others who just see themselves as cosmopolitans, global citizens, who can move around the world with many different languages. Also, we have this a growing number of young adopted children from China, and many of their adoptive parents are non-Chinese, and issues around identity and community and so on are very interesting with that population, and you may have students who come from those backgrounds. I mentioned the older learners, retirees, transnationals who move across borders, and then the virtual or distant learners. It used to be seen as quite exceptional when you had someone like Kevin Rudd speaking Mandarin, impressing delegates and his own population, first of all. But we can see that as more people reach advanced levels by starting earlier, and pipeline where you have great articulation between the lower grade levels all the way up through the end of the undergraduate years, K-16, and then beyond, so that you have people building on their past learning and dealing with content at the higher levels in increasingly sophisticated ways. Well, research on Chinese language teaching and learning has been relatively recent, given the century of Chinese language learning that I mentioned earlier, especially in BC. And just in the late 2000s, all of a sudden, there were a number of books published that were trying to keep up with the wave. So work by, these are 3 publications from the US, Chinese as a Heritage Language, Fostering Rooted World Citizenry, by Agnes He and Yun Shao. Teaching Chinese as a Foreign Language, this is a book in the middle that's particularly important for teacher development, thinking about how to use technology, how to teach culture, how to engage students in language, and so on. And then the book on the right is Research among Learners of Chinese as a Foreign Language. And then on this slide, on the 2 right-hand books are from Australia, Learning Chinese, Turning Chinese, Challenges to Becoming Sinophone, Chinese speaking, in a Globalized World by MacDonald. And on the right, Teaching and Learning Chinese in Global Context by Song and Cruikshank. And finally, on the left is the book that Jan just mentioned that my colleagues and I just published, which is about learning Chinese and some of the recent research on that. Okay, I'm going to shift a little bit for a moment to talk about how some national standards have been developed, or local standards for language teaching, and what's missing in looking at that. These are very important standards, but I'm going to then say what's been missing from these kinds of ways of framing language teaching and learning. This is the 5 C's model from the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages. I believe there was a talk before mine this morning that talked about ACLS standards and the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which is CEFR. But let me just show you this for a minute. This 5 C's model says that in language teaching, it's not just about the linguistic code. It's not just about grammar. It's not just about vocabulary. We need to, of course, help people communicate. And what does that mean? It means both orally and in writing, of course, depending on the purposes and levels. Being able to do that for different audiences. Well, in the heritage language context, one of the challenges for many students is that they have learned to communicate in the kitchen with their parents and siblings, but they're not as skilled at speaking formally and in more polite, more sophisticated language to strangers or people who are not closely related. Being able to communicate also about different topics, to convey information, and for different purposes and using different genres. What's a genre? For example, writing a letter is one kind of genre. Writing a piece, a letter to the editor, is the same genre but different in style than a personal letter. Writing an essay, writing a personal narrative, those are different genres. We also know that language teaching and learning involves becoming enculturated, learning about cultures, and not only about the target language culture, Chinese in this case, also about other cultures one is interacting with. Understanding the practices, the perspectives, the ideologies, the values. On the bottom right, connections means learning about other disciplines. So it's not just learning to communicate in an everyday face-to-face way, but learning to make connections across disciplines in the target language. Comparisons means becoming more aware of similarities and differences across languages and cultures. And finally, communities, the final circle here on the left, is that in learning a language, we're also learning to participate in different communities, local communities, global communities, and they may be of different types. For the British Columbia, in the integrated resource package I mentioned a few minutes ago, we also have a set of standards that's not so very different. It involves communicating, acquiring information, experiencing creative works, understanding culture and society. So some of those same things come up in our curriculum. And as I said, you can get this online through the BC Ministry of Education. And also the tools that are used. Now this is a bit dated, 1998, so it still has audio cassettes. Some of you may not know what those are. Films and so on. So, but all the different kinds of media that we can tap into to make these creative works or other kinds of information more engaging, more salient. So now I'm going to shift a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the kind of research that I have been doing and some others have been doing that looks beyond accumulating knowledge and even beyond becoming intercultural, and says, what does it really mean to learn a language in terms of one's sense of self and one's place in the world? So this is being called, in my field, second language acquisition theory, a kind of social turn or sociocultural turn in research, from understanding what used to be the case would be understanding, the aptitude of the language learner, motivation, motivated or not motivated, analytic learner or non-analytic. It goes beyond that. and focuses more on learners' experiences, their sense of agency. Do they feel they have some control in their language learning? Do they have choice? Do they feel they're developing a voice in another language? A voice, a different self in a way of being in the language and projecting oneself. And many other things that are listed here that I'm going to talk about in turn. But a lot of it is about the participating in communities and taking part in very interesting journeys as learners, as global citizens, as people moving across cultures and sometimes staying in between spaces that are not always very comfortable, feeling neither one nor the other, not sure where they fit, and so on, especially with youth. So this view of learning says learning is done through experience, constructing and internalizing meaning and accumulating knowledge. That's true. But more than that, it's learning to belong to and participate in multiple communities, one's own and others. Learning is doing. It's not just internal knowledge, it's being able to do, to act, to practice oral, literate, multimodal skills, rap, poetry in the case of Jen Walls. It's learning as becoming, taking on new identities or new expanded aspects of identity. So let's take a little child here on the bottom left. That child is, say, born into a Chinese family, the target culture up here, or has come into a Chinese-speaking environment one way or another. Or the person may be older and may not be Chinese. And we can say these are the learners, novice Chinese learners, as heritage or non-heritage language. And they're seeking access to and membership in the Chinese-speaking world, let's say. And how is that made possible? Well, it's through interacting with people like you, parents, teachers, older siblings, friends, and others in the Chinese-speaking community, and a series of interactions over time that help them aim toward and become part of those target communities. But we mustn't forget that these learners also usually have other primary affiliations, other communities, which may be mediated by English, or Spanish, or French, or that may be more about sports or music, other communities that they are even more invested in a way. And so they're juggling this tension between getting to this target through Chinese and also managing their other favorite communities, clubs, activities, and that sort of thing through other languages. So they may be aiming to become proficient, competent in those cultures. And then for many, you may have noticed this, many students will drop out at a certain point, and it doesn't mean they're bad students, but there may be other reasons. They've moved, they've started up something new, they don't have time, or they just felt that it's not for them, at least now. But they may return later to the language and to the cultures, and that's what we'll see in the cases I present. So they're negotiating these different communities and languages, facing things like peer pressure, especially for children, and access issues to the communities they want to be part of, whether English communities or Chinese communities, issues of acceptance, accommodation, whether people welcome them into those communities, whether they resist or others resist their participation. They may feel ambivalent and so on. And then there are many other personal factors that may come to bear as well. Desire and so on. And they may end up just being in some kind of third space or hybrid space where they're between these different worlds and communities by necessity. So these are different learning pathways. In the Chinese heritage language context in particular, this is a very familiar profile where we have in red here, let's say the person speaks Mandarin at home, and in this sort of orange bar on the left over here, it's, let's say there's another dialect spoken, Cantonese. And in childhood, of course, in the home, if that's what their parents speak, they're immersed in it, and that's the default language. But as soon as they get to school, there's a shift, because English becomes very, very important. To belong to peer cultures, to not look different in terms of language behaviors and so on. And in the North American or Australian or New Zealand, British experiences, this is a very common trajectory. Once the person shifts to English, we actually call that language shift. They continue on, unless there's some other kinds of intervention. And along the way, they may take up new languages, French and Japanese or Spanish, to varying outcomes. And then later on, often here at UBC, students who dropped out of their heritage schools at this point or stopped speaking Chinese in the home come back and say, now I'm ready. Now I'm ready to be Chinese, to learn more about my Chinese heritage. And often there is this gap in between these 2 points. And additional coursework will help them perhaps move up to the highest levels, depending on how long they stay with it. If they have limited opportunities, chances are they will sort of drop out for the time being. If they move to Chinese-speaking regions, as more and more of our graduates do, their trajectory will continue. And so these are some of the common developmental patterns, especially in Chinese as a heritage language. So now let me give you 4 case studies of contemporary learners and users of Chinese. And 2 of them are heritage learners. This one that I'm going to call Jason. Jason is a composite that Agnes He, who's a researcher in the States, at the State University of New York, she has done a lot of research with heritage language learners in the New York State area, Long Island, from preschool up to university. And so she hasn't done longitudinal studies following one learner all the way, but she's done a lot of research at each stage, and she created a composite, Jason, based on the typical patterns she observed across levels. The second learner is Kay from a study Duan Li and I did. We surveyed 700 students at a Canadian university regarding their motives and attitudes toward Chinese, different orthographies and backgrounds and so on and so forth. And then we sampled 20 students from different Chinese regions originally. And then I'm going to give you just one example, Kay. And then the non-heritage learners, this is from one of our studies, just finished, Ella, and this, actually it's Esther. For Kay, we get to see her moving into her mid-20s, post-BA in Chinese. And for the non-heritage learners, we have Ella to about her mid-30s, mid to late 30s, and Stella to her late 70s, learning Chinese. So we can see the migration or mobility histories of these 4, starting with Jason. He came from southern China. At age 3, moved to New York. Number 2, Kay's case from Hong Kong. Moved to Europe, then moved to Canada, then moved to China. In Ella's case, from BC originally, went to China, back and forth to Canada, then to Taiwan and back, and Sheila between Australia and China. Now, when I talk about identities, communities, and trajectories, these are the kinds of questions I'm asking. Who are you? Why are you learning Chinese? How much choice do you have in the matter? As adults, we usually have choice. As children, often not so much choice. Do you feel like a legitimate learner and speaker of Chinese? For people who come from dialect backgrounds, when they get to standard Mandarin learning context, they're sometimes positioned as illegitimate, dysfunctional, which is very harmful to their sense of themselves. Is Chinese a resource or a liability for you? Why? How important is proficiency in Chinese to your sense of who you are and who you would like to become? Not just what you want to do, who you want to become. How does your identity as a Sinophone, a Chinese speaker, relate to your other identities and abilities? How does Chinese language learning, formally and informally, help you achieve your personal goals and desires? How do others view you? How do others view you when you learn or use Chinese? One of the things I'll come to is with some heritage learners, they're often positioned as, fake Chinese. That's a quote that came from one. Is you're Chinese, but you don't speak Chinese, or that's how you speak terrible Chinese, and people start to feel really, really bad. And what kinds of identities are imposed on you as a Chinese language learner by yourself, by family members, teachers, peers, textbooks, and so on. For communities, these are the questions we ask. What kinds of communities support your learning and use of Chinese? Where are those communities? How are they mediated? Mediated being through teachers, through textbooks, through online materials, other tools. How much affinity do you feel with these communities? How close do you feel? How much do you feel aligned with them and the people in them and their cultural and linguistic practices? Do you feel you belong? What kinds of community memberships constrain your engagements with Chinese? Take you away from Chinese, for instance? What issues prevent fuller participation in Chinese-speaking communities or social networks? And finally, so trajectory is the sense of pathway, developmental pathway. How would you describe your journey or development as a Chinese language learner? Has your developmental pathway into both language and culture been seamless and relatively linear, steadily accumulating greater knowledge? If not, what mitigating factors account for your experiences, for the ups and downs and ins and outs? So these are the kinds of things that when we're doing this research, we're looking at in the stories, the narrative, the accounts, the interviews with our participants. So I'll go through them one by one. Here's Jason. And this is Agnes He's quote from Jason. He says, "My home language is Chinese. My parents are from China. They praised me, scolded me, all in Chinese." I think the scolded got underlined, actually. My Chinese is really bad. I can't read, and I can only write my name. But when I think of Chinese, I think of my mom, dad, and home. It's the language of my home and my heart. Actually, Agnes is writing a book right now, supported by a very prestigious fellowship, and it's something like The Language of My Heart, and about her research in this area. So that's when Jason was younger, and here's another quote, and this is from He, the researcher, giving a kind of overview of his ability. She said, "He speaks Cantonese and understands Mandarin, but cannot read or write in Chinese, a very common heritage language profile. He was born in China and immigrated to the US when he was 3. At that time, he spoke Cantonese at home with his parents, grandmother, and aunt. He had some knowledge of English from television and from the children he played with, who spoke a mixture of languages." When Jason first started school, his English was weak. In fact, he was placed in ESL classes. But very soon, he was speaking English fluently and became one of the highest achieving students in his class. Now he speaks English to his parents, not Cantonese. He only speaks Cantonese with his grandmother, with whom he keeps a minimal level of communication. His parents once sent him to a weekend Chinese language school where he was taught Mandarin. He went for a year, but felt the teacher was just totally boring, and he didn't learn anything. His best friends now at college include Bob, his roommate, who's from a Jewish cultural background. He, Jason, is also seriously dating a Mandarin-speaking girl, very good for language retention, possibly the strongest motivator of all. When asked why he is taking Chinese as a heritage language, Jason said, "I'm Chinese. I feel stupid not knowing the language. Plus, I'd like to do business in China someday." We could say that that's a kind of integrative motivation, wanting to have a more integrated sense of his own identity, but then with some instrumental motivation, goals to use language. As Jan said so well, it's not just about looking back to one's past, it's looking forward to one's future, one's opportunities, one's sense of oneself, and what one could become. So here's the kind of summary of how he came at age 3 and has remained in New York State. There might have been little trips, and we don't know where this will end with Jason in terms of his trajectory. But this kind of shift from Chinese languages to English, as I said before, is absolutely typical. And for the oldest child, it may be a little bit later. For the second child, the siblings, their shift to English will happen even sooner because the siblings will usually speak in English to each other. So some people say, how come my first child was so much better at Chinese and this and the second one? It's because of the with intra-generational use of English and the shift. Very, very typical. So anyway, and there's constant negotiation between Chinese languages, identities, and cultures, especially at home, where his parents want him to use more Chinese, and he's using English, and all of that. So that's Jason. Here's a very different kind of learner. This is someone who came from Hong Kong originally, and her father was not Chinese. Father was European, German-speaking Dane, who also spoke Danish, and who had business between Europe and China and Hong Kong for many, many years, but never learned Chinese himself, Cantonese or Mandarin. Her mother, on the other hand, was Chinese, speaking Cantonese, also Mandarin, Sichuanese, German, Danish, and maybe English, but she never mentioned English. If you look at her, though, she doesn't look like a heritage learner, but she is a heritage learner. She was very close to her mother. In Hong Kong, she went to a Cantonese-English bilingual school and then started Mandarin at an international school in Hong Kong. But rather than migrate directly to North America, the family moved back to Denmark for 8 years, and she got immersed in Danish and German. Only when she came to a Canadian university did she start to study Mandarin again, as well as German. And then she, at one point in our interviews with her, said now she preferred the sound of Mandarin to Cantonese. She was really getting into Mandarin. But she still felt more proficient in Danish. 3 years later, we contacted Kay again to see where she was and what she was doing. And by then she was at a Canadian university doing a graduate degree that involved research in Shanghai, where she was using her Mandarin and becoming fully immersed. So this is the trajectory is very non-linear, back and forth, and yet with each new language, with each new cultural experience, their repertoire, There's the resources they have, the options they have for the future, for work, for life, for self-actualization is expanded. This is what Kay said in 2005. She said, we said, why are you learning Mandarin and at this time, given your background? She said, I find it very important in terms of my cultural background to learn Chinese. That for me, it's basically to fulfill my interest toward the Chinese culture and tradition and language. So that's why I'm learning Chinese right now, and I feel almost like it's a duty for me to carry on my pursuit and learning the Chinese language. But she didn't feel that way when she was younger. And when she was in Denmark, she wasn't studying Mandarin. It's only at a certain, in people's 20s, they often come to this realization, it's time. Now, not everyone comes to that realization. So, because she moved to Europe after she said this for some time. But then in 2008, she said, I still use much Chinese, and I'm writing my thesis on rural-urban migration in China. I'm now in Shanghai. She actually emailed us from Shanghai, and she was very excited to report back. This is what I'm doing. I'm finalizing the last part of my research. The thesis topic is on floating or migrant population in China and their housing circumstances. It was in sociology. She was interviewing the participants in Mandarin, and I imagine she was also adding some Shanghainese to her repertoire too. Although many of the migrants don't, they might speak Mandarin or Shanghainese or other dialects. It's been a very exciting experience meeting migrants and talking to them in Chinese about their predicaments and aspirations. Well, if you go back to this, who would have predicted that that would be her focus? At this point in Canada, she was in political science. And that was not her intention to do research in China or to do sociological graduate research. One never knows. Okay, the third case is Ella. Ella is from BC, a small town in BC, with a Hungarian mother and an Anglo-Canadian father. And she came from a very fundamental religious background where she was quite isolated within the community, but really wanted to see the world. And Ella was really terrific, and still is in wushu, in kung fu. And so she went to China to study kung fu. Language wasn't it, it was kung fu. And she learned some Mandarin there and was going back and forth between China and Canada. And later, quite a bit later, at about age 26, came back to study Chinese as a major at UBC. She went back to China, back and forth. But one thing that she really didn't like was always being called a Lao Wai. When she was in China, she said, what can I do? I'm never going to be a real Chinese Sinophone. I'm always a Lao Wai. But when she came to graduate school, it rekindled her interest in Chinese, because at that point she said, what's the point? It takes so much effort. In fact, she won prizes, she won scholarships based on her Chinese. She was very proficient up to that point, but then she said, what's the point? It takes so much effort. But then she became part of our research project, actually, and she got interested in Chinese again. And she applied for a Taiwanese scholarship to study in Taiwan. And then she said, after all the years of learning simplified characters, she says, I've switched to traditional. And then she came and did her final research project, her thesis on Chinese. So that was her trajectory. Well, where has she ended up? She's in Canada. She has a job that involves some Chinese in immigration. But she'd spent the last 6 months in Mexico, and her Spanish is coming along well. She didn't use much Chinese in Mexico. This is what she said. I'm sorry, it's a rather long quote, but I think it's very telling. She says, I realize that Chinese is a tool I've been using to see how deeply and how permanently I can transform myself. It's a full decade since I first landed in China. This was in 2009 when she wrote it. I can think of nothing else from 1999 that continues to exist in my life the way Chinese still does. Perhaps because of all those 1999, all those lines. If a language can be said to have tenacity, and I think it can, then I would say Chinese does. Despite many odds, it has stuck in my life like a powerful glue, keeping me attached to at least one thing, while so many other things have come and gone, relationships and other things in her life. The paradox of something so foreign existing in my life as a tool for so many personal epiphanies is not lost on me. Every day I discover more of how studying Chinese compels me to adopt new ways of perceiving, understanding, and engaging with the world, with language, and especially with myself as I exist in relation to multiple communities. Now you would think this is more like a heritage language person saying this, how it's been the common thread across many of her experiences. But this is a non-heritage learner who embraced Chinese, who left behind other cultures, customs and values from her home background and left that community, has been very transnational, but you can see the power it has given her. She has embraced it. She's sometimes fought with it and with her identity as Lao Wai, as I said, but still it has been very powerful in her life. This is when, before she went to Taiwan, she was writing from our research project, she was transcribing something she said, and then after she came back. And I should point out, as a feminist, she also likes to play with characters to add a more female kind of value system. So she's quite playful with her language use. Finally, Stella. Stella is fascinating. Stella was born in 1934 in South Africa, where she came from English and Afrikaans, two language backgrounds. She's now nearly 80 years old in a wheelchair. She lives in Australia. She moved to Australia with her young family in 1969, so when she was in her mid-30s. This is what Stella says. I learned Chinese because I love languages. I love Chinese people. I have a son who speaks very fluent Chinese, and I have 2 little Chinese granddaughters. And I've been to China, and I like it and would love to see more. I would classify it, learning Chinese, as a lifetime's ambition. Now let's look at her profile. Actually, when she first moved to Australia, she was on a farm. She's a farm worker. Her husband was a school teacher, but she worked on the farm. She did a diploma in Japanese, and they were in a remote area of Australia. She first started Chinese in an evening class at age 58. She got impatient with the teachers and other students. I guess she felt she didn't have much time to lose, so she'd better get going. And then when her son and her daughter-in-law went to China for 6 years, she visited them often, and she really took up Chinese in a new way. And ever since then, she's been taking coursework through distance education with the university, through private tutors, by Skype with China, and so on, and going back and forth to China. She's now a widow and still engaging in Skype-based tutoring with her long-time tutor in China. Now, because of her physical disabilities, she wouldn't be able to get insurance to travel to China. She was hospitalized in Australia for half a year in 2011, but when she spoke Chinese with the medical staff who were Chinese, they thought she was having hallucinations. Nobody around her who wasn't Chinese knew what she was saying, and they said, she's just chatting with us in Chinese. They didn't know she knew Chinese. So even when she was unconscious, they said Chinese was coming out of her mouth. She says, at age 79, she said, studying Chinese is something I can do with enjoyment and without being a nuisance to people. But I don't spend nearly enough time on it. She plans to keep with it till the end of her days. So, just a few minutes now to wrap up and discuss the different roles these individuals have in family, in community, in society. We saw Jason as a Chinese-American son. Non-Chinese people saw him as Chinese and expected him to speak and read and write Chinese. Chinese people, including himself, saw him as American because he didn't speak and read and write enough Chinese. He had a strong desire to fit into his peer groups and was kind of annoyed by pressure on him early on to learn Chinese. Kay was the researcher in Shanghai eventually who moved across national boundaries and languages and then found a very good use for her Chinese language knowledge. Ella had some use of Chinese at work and online, and she felt that the best Chinese-speaking networks she developed were when she was in Taiwan for that 6 months, where she was involved in poetry groups and Chinese literature groups, and she felt it was very meaningful. Stella, as the farm wife, was tired every day when she was working, and at night she found it hard to study Chinese. Her husband was a little jealous of the time she spent on Chinese. He was kind of, what are you doing up there all night? You know, she said, I'm studying Chinese. And he was a bit ambivalent or resistant, but she felt that it was the one thing that gave her life a great deal of meaning in addition to family. People felt different degrees of distance from Mandarin-speaking groups based on where they were located, how they were positioned. Many of them mentioned the reading materials that they had both in school, Chinese school, and out of school was limited, wasn't interesting. For all of them, they had goals to gain many new experiences and relationships of all types, and for some instrumental goals as well, related to career and studies. So, in summary, the kinds of identities, communities, and trajectories that come up were, with respect to Chinese, the desire to be unique, to be special, to be validated, to feel true to oneself. In Stella's case, to be independent. She didn't need anyone else except for a tutor, but she wanted to be an independent, advanced speaker of Chinese. Wanted to be cosmopolitans who could move back and forth. In terms of communities, they wanted to be connected to Chinese-speaking communities, but also often had issues around access, integration, or identification, or peer pressure to become part of other language-speaking groups. And yet a wish, a desire to become, to maintain a place in Chinese-speaking networks. And the trajectories we saw, very non-linear, very interrupted with setbacks and as new goals and priorities came into place. So here are finally some implications of this work. For many students across the spectrum, at least as we heard it from Jason and some others from that kind of work, including work we did, Chinese learning is not fun. It's not engaging, at least at school. It's not intrinsically motivating. They report that the teaching methods or materials may deny or ignore their interests and lives and don't match up with the way they learn in mainstream English education. For example, in He's work, she said there was one heritage language program and the kids were doing character writing, and one child said, can we have a competition beside? And the teacher said, no, we don't do that here. You do that in American school. We're Chinese, we don't do competitions. And the students are, aww. So we need to make learning more meaningful, creative, personal, fun. It's not all about the homeland, whichever homeland that may be, but also about their current lives and worlds and local interests. we can see from the long-term profiles that students commonly reject Chinese earlier in their lives, and yet many return to it later, especially if they still have that desire and if some of their early experiences were positive. And then they may learn different dialects, different orthographies, and so on. The textbooks for teaching Chinese, especially in heritage language contexts, have proved contentious for some students. They feel there's too much emphasis on family values and morality, too pedantic about being an ideal Chinese child, being loyal, patient, diligent, and so on. That to be a real Chinese, you have to have gone to the Great Wall, or those sorts of things. That rather than think of them as Chinese here, it's often in relation to being in Taiwan or being in China, mainland China. And actually one of our MA students did her thesis looking at these themes across the Huayu and Zhongwen textbook series. And she, this is Loretta Cho, who used to teach at the Calgary Chinese School and did her master's here. She now is at University of Calgary. She herself came from Taiwan at age 14, became a Chinese language teaching assistant very young, when she was still a teenager, at the Chinese schools. Her younger sister rejected Chinese outright from age 5. And this is what Loretta, after many years of teaching, said: "I witnessed some of my own Chinese students grow less and less interested in learning Chinese. Throughout my career, I had numerous opportunities to obtain feedback from parents and students. One boy in grade 4 expressed that he wanted to learn Chinese, but he simply did not understand and did not connect with the textbooks." Another one, a parent said her daughter was doing very well, but they felt that one of the biggest challenges they encountered was for her to be interested in the textbooks. And finally, Loretta says, "It was after hearing their comments that I began to study the very textbooks that she herself, Loretta, had used for many years. I eventually realized that within the content of the textbooks, there was a strong underlying ideology about being an authentic Chinese person, which conflicted, I'll just summarize, with their own sense of who they were." And she said, "It was from there that I came to conclude that many Chinese heritage language learners, including my own sister, were lost with, and indeed rebelled against, the concept of being Chinese in a society where the mainstream culture is about not only being Chinese." So she said here we need to find a better way of bridging the gaps between the ideal Chinese child presented in textbooks and the worlds and lives and desires of the students, so that there can be some happy coming together. Okay, I'm going to just end with the final point here that says that we need to help students and ourselves become confident, curious, autonomous, lifelong learners and global citizens. And taking a page from Stella's book, it's never too late to start learning Chinese, although it might take longer. And I'll just end with that. Thank you very much.
Isn't she great? You can tell that she comes to us from the Faculty of Education, not from the Faculty of Arts. In the Faculty of Arts we have very little concept of time and the importance of leaving space for other people to talk. She has left us with 8 minutes for Q&A. I can say, for starters, that having taught Chinese language to both Rai and people who had a family background in Chinese, everything that she has mentioned here in every case study, I've seen her. And I'm trying to think of an exception to it, and I can't. So I think you've covered, from my experience, you've covered just about everything. Does anyone have questions or comments? Anything that Professor Duff didn't say that she should have said? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Margarita. I speak Spanish, and I then English, and then French. I live in a French community where I have made workshops in French. And I felt that a lot of times when I present myself to my Chinese peers, I said I'm a banana because I think Western. And even though my parents raised me as Chinese, there was the Chinese language at home. And the reason I came back to Chinese is I have to live 500 years to continue learning. It's a learning process. And I think when I talked, well, Dr. Walt, when we talked yesterday, I felt you're pushing us to improve ourselves in speaking the Chinese language too. I know I speak it when I'm with Westerners. I speak Chinese. But when with the Chinese, more so. And I make a lot of mistakes all the time, and I think some of my colleagues say that, and I say things that are not appropriate in the Chinese language. So for me, it's a constant learning. And when I saw that, and I go, that's the picture that you have painted for all of us. I'm a big case study too through that. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. Originally from the Montreal Chinese School, and but I think that's the problem with being in a country that's officially bilingual is people focus on the English-French bilingual aspect, and we know most of the bilinguals are francophones who add English, not so many English who add French, but all the other languages, all the other career and personal paths that we need to understand. And one of the big trends in second language learning theory right now also is to say, when we're teaching a language within a multilingual context, we're not trying to create new monolinguals in Chinese. There's no way, as a Spanish speaker, English speaker, a French speaker, there's no way you're going to be like a monolingual Chinese speaker. You have the advantage of all those other resources, all those other ways of being, ways of speaking. And to expect perfection is very unreasonable in a multilingual world. We do what we can, but we shouldn't be unreasonable in our expectations at different levels. And I add my comment to you, which is I also need to work on my Chinese. I don't have 500 years left. Question in the back, please.
Thank you, Dr. Duff. That was a very, very excellent talk. I was very moved. I was myself born in the Philippines, and I learned my Mandarin in the Philippines. And I found that I hated learning Chinese when I was small, but I found that it's my real joy now. My question is, from your research and your experience, your expertise, what kind of texts, because we see that they talk about the textbook that they use. What would you suggest? What kind of textbook? Should it be through the teacher, the educator, to find the proper text material for their students?
Thank you, and thank you for your experience coming from the Philippines, speaking probably Tagalog or Ilocano as well as Mandarin and English. The textbooks, I should say, it might have sounded critical, especially given the Taiwan officials here who have supported the preparation and the free dissemination of these materials, and heaven knows they're better than what used to be used in many ways. But I think the point is that they need to be at least complemented or supplemented with things that people are interested in reading. It could be Harry Potter in Chinese. You know, at first they say, well, you're not getting Chinese culture. But we know from reading research, the best predictor of good reading proficiency is free reading that people enjoy because they want to find out what happens on the next page. Or, you know, finding other kinds of texts that are age and level appropriate, but where they feel some kind of connection, personal connection. And of course, the ones from China and Taiwan, provide valuable language input, but it's all about being a good person, and it's like a lot of morality. It's just part of it, but it's, they want to find out interesting things. Maybe you can have students also looking for materials that are of interest to them, but trying to find interesting resources about their lives in Canada, or the States, or Australia, wherever the case may be, and not only referenced to Taiwan or China. It's a start, isn't it? It's a base, but we need to find things and dialogue that's maybe more interesting. So I have a dialogue on here. I'll show you from the Zhongwen. This is in English, but it's in Chinese in the original. How many years have you been Chinese? This is Ming Ming and Liang Liang. How many years have you been learning Chinese? Learning Chinese for 2 years. You're making good progress. Your Chinese is not bad either. I want to continue learning Chinese. I like learning Chinese. Okay. But it's hard to compete with all the other, the topics of greater interest. It's very formulaic, and yes, you're a good Chinese person because you speak Chinese. So what are you interested in? Can you talk about sports in Chinese? Can you talk about interesting movies that you've seen in Chinese? Can you bring in your own lives to the classroom? This may be one important source of input, but bringing in the other. What are you seeing? What are you doing? What makes you who you are? And can you talk about that? Can you write about that? And I understand their heritage language education is conservative. It wants to conserve and preserve important values, traditions, language being one of them, cultural aspects. But in education, we know we need to build on what students already know and what they're already interested in. And from that foundation, they're more likely to stay in the courses with greater retention of knowledge and actual participation. Other question? Maybe one more? No more. That's it.
I've had the unfortunate experience of offending Ye Xiaozhang before, and I don't want to offend her again. So I think during lunch, will you be here for lunch for a little while? If you have questions or comments, you are welcome to grab hold of her as soon as this is finished. Again, the organizers have authorized me to present you with the token of their appreciation for your presentation. You've been talking for over an hour, and you must be thirsty. 还有，香蕉女士啊，我是煮鸡蛋，幸亏